Hello and welcome to Sips and Substance, where we distill politics down to its essence and have fun doing it. I'm Justin, coming at you from the center right. As an engineer, I'm very process and data driven, so I always do my best to filter out the nonsense and find reliable signals that you find in our politics.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. I'm a little bit more left than Justin, except maybe on some international relations kind of stuff. As a professor, I tend to be more interested in things like causal chains and mechanisms and stuff like that. I think we do a pretty good job of keeping each other honest.
So, today we're going to discuss three topics that are somewhat loosely related. We're obviously going to talk about the debate, and spoiler alert, Kamala won. But ultimately, it might not matter in terms of the election outcome. So we'll be discussing that. We'll also be discussing the good, the bad, and the illegal regarding foreign influence on U.S. policy, as well as our elections. We're going to put a special emphasis on the recent indictment involving Russian attempts to influence the conversation. And then we're also going to discuss if the influence campaigns even matter. And then lastly, we are going to have a discussion regarding Kamala Harris's proposed housing policy and whether or not it will actually help accomplish reducing housing costs.
Yeah, I think those give us a nice sort of assortment of things to talk about today. I have a beer and a beer shirt for the week that I think is going to, I wanted to show a little solidarity with the people in Ohio, where I'm originally from. So I brought my Rheingeist Brewing t-shirt. It's not quite near Columbus where Springfield is, but it's close. And my brother lives there and he has 2 dogs. So we're going to have solidarity with Ohio dogs. At the same time, pulled out an original extra IPA. It's an Imperial IPA, a little stronger than your average beer from Dogfish Head. Again, we want to show some solidarity with the poor pets that are being eaten, I guess allegedly, we'll have to say, what's going on in Ohio. This beer, by the way, really solid beer from Dogfish Head. They make some really good beers. This is one of the original Imperial IPAs. Lots of hops, good resiny flavors to it, very well balanced with nice malt. So if you're looking for a good Imperial IPA, the 90-minute IPA from Dogfish Head is very solid. I've liked it forever, more or less.
So I will be having a White Russian to go along with our foreign policy analysis there. How could I resist a White Russian? Okay, so for our first segment, we're going to talk about the presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Boy, I don't know if I regret watching that or not, but I have to for the sake of the show, right? We're going to discuss, the strategy of, the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign and what they tried to accomplish during the debate. We'll talk about, how appropriate it is for moderators to get involved. And then, some other key takeaways. So, Jonathan,
I have to say, I enjoyed watching the debate because this is the first time in the history of debate watching for me, and I've been watching debates for a long time, longer than I'd care to admit, that I was actually laughing out loud. I literally I'm glad we weren't playing a drinking game, because the one that I would have chosen, I would have been 3 sheets to the wind long before that debate was over. And the Springfield stuff kept coming up. Whew. That was something. But we'll get into that later. But I think it does make sense to start with what were the candidates trying to do going in? And for the Trump strategy, there's kind of I think two ways to look at it. There was what Trump's campaign was hoping he would do, and what Trump was probably going to do all along, right? I think the Trump campaign wants to define Harris as far left, right, and say that she's just the Biden administration redux. Inflation's bad, immigration's bad, Harris is bad, nothing to see, move along, right? Talk about how great things were when Trump was president before, and then try to pivot away from things like abortion, right? But the number one thing that I think his campaign wanted him to do is not take the bait, not fight back. I'm guessing be sane, right? But part of that is not be Trump. And I'm guessing he never had any intention of doing that. He thinks he wants to fight, at least he wants to fight all the time. I think he thinks he has to. He thinks it's good for him with his supporters. And I think for a certain subset it is. But he is going to take the bait every time, and I think he thinks he looks strong when he does that.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, the moment where I realized the debate was over, because I think for the first half an hour, I think it was within the realm of reason, right? Or I shouldn't say the realm of reason,
Maybe
the
10
realm of
minutes.
the realm of expectations for the two candidates, right?
Okay.
Trump didn't completely shit the bed at that point, um, and Kamala was, doing what she was doing. Um, but when Kamala started attacking Trump for the crowd sizes
Yeah,
and
the
people
crowd
leaving
size
his
is where he
rallies,
really.
um, I think it was clear that, during her debate prep, it was all right. Let's just find a way to get Trump flustered, and it clearly worked, right? Because then he just went on this like tirade of Haitian immigrants eating
Springfield.
dogs, their pets, um, and if you're plugged into the right wing ecosystem, like really plugged in, you're aware of that story. But most Americans are just like, "What are you talking about, man?" And I think it would benefit Trump if he just had people who were just not so online all the time, who were just aware of uh, what people actually want to listen to, which is economic policy and immigration policy, which are Trump's strengths.
Do you think that would matter? Because he has people that are telling him what to do. They're telling him that, exactly that. And he watches the news all the time, even though he says he doesn't.
Sure.
And every Republican talking head on any channel is saying exactly that. I don't. I really don't think you can reach him at this point. I think he's completely convinced that he knows what he's doing, and he does what he has to do. And anybody that doubts what he's doing is they're just haters, to use that the modern vernacular.
Maybe, but we've seen Trump be disciplined by his standards before, right? Um, you know,
Recently, though,
well, I mean, I would say that when Biden post debate Biden, right? Trump was not in the news at all.
actually, I think you're right. He was very disciplined at the
Yeah,
debate for his standards. He had to talk about golf and
right,
some ridiculousness, but
right.
largely he sat back and watched Joe Biden light himself on fire, and he did a
Right.
pretty
And
good
then
job with
also, and
that.
then, the media was really going after Biden. Please drop out. Please drop out.
Yep,
To that effect. And Trump just didn't really make the news. And that was hugely beneficial to him.
that's true.
And we know that his campaign is capable of reining him in, right? So I do think that there's just something going on in the campaign where, the ultra online people are just getting his ear now. And it's just not going to work out well for him
Well,
at
I
all.
think along those lines, I think it was useful to note that he showed up for the debate in Philadelphia with Laura Loomer on his plane. Now, I didn't know who this woman is, but apparently she's one of those ultra online complete whack jobs that's pushing all these conspiracy theories, Springfield first and foremost. And if she's traveling on the plane with him, that I think gives you some pretty good insight about one, his mindset, and about two, who has access to him right now. And again, I guess three, about the campaign not being able to really rein that in at the moment.
Yeah, when you're when Marjorie Taylor Greene calls you a bigot, you've got problems.
That's
So let's move
fair.
on to the Harris strategy, though. Um, Clearly, baiting Trump to show that he's unfit for president. I think she nailed that, right?
Oh yeah.
But I think you also have to show, hey, are you ready for the job, right? Um, Surprisingly, Harris is still largely undefined. People know who she is, but they don't know what she stands for. So her job during the debate was to, one, appear ready, be in control, and then articulate a vision, and then more importantly, policy. Um, because people allegedly want to know about that, right? Um, and then
Very
try
much
and pivot.
allegedly.
Yes, and then try and pivot away on some of the weak issues that you have, which are immigration, economy, inflation, things like that. And I actually think she did a fairly decent job. I wouldn't say a stellar job, right? Um, there were times when she got into some details on policy, um, but I think because most people don't watch the debate in its entirety, it would have been good to have some sort of structure where you say, hey, here's my vision. Here's an example of a policy that's going to help me outline that vision, right? So if you pepper all that out throughout the debate, then you get more reach in terms of, hey, I have a policy and I have a vision, right? Because at the end
Yeah,
of the day, go ahead.
I think that makes a lot of sense. If the voters really want policy, or the media is just telling us that the voters think they want policy, maybe there's a misread there. Because I really don't think we'll get into the undecideds here in a minute. We think, does this matter? But a lot of people who say they want policy, right? They're like saying, well, I don't know if I can vote for Kamala Harris because she doesn't have policy. Well, what are Donald Trump's policies? Explain to me those.
Right.
Explain to me. So I think a lot of it is somebody's coming up with a narrative that, oh, we don't know who Kamala Harris is. And people are like, yeah, we don't know who Kamala Harris is. We need to have more policies. I thought for a debate, I mean, if you think about what you see in a traditional debate, you don't see somebody basically reading a policy white paper, right?
Right. You definitely don't want that.
She gave some good policy updates. She could have done a few more. But I thought she did a pretty decent job of outlining some differences. Now, the thing where I thought she was weak, at least in the beginning until Trump stole the show, is the very first question was, hey, are we better off than we were 4 years ago? Right? And that should be an easy answer. Of course. Right? And later on, she kind of said that. Trump left us with this and this and this and this and this. So I don't know why you don't say, well, yes, we're better off than we were 4 years ago because he left us with this. But instead, she just pivoted to, I have an economic goal for the future. Like, that's great. But when you start off by just ignoring I think people forget this. She started off by ignoring this question when I thought it was kind of a softball. If you don't, I mean, because her argument is we're better off in a lot of ways because he ruined a lot of things, right? He broke things when he was in the White House and we fixed them. So yes, we're better off. You can qualify that, right? People aren't blind, but to just completely ignore that, I think if Trump wasn't as bad as he ended up being, that would have come back to haunt her a little bit more.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. It's really amazing to me that when it comes to the pandemic, people just forget that it happened during the Trump administration, or that they just don't care, right? They just think it's like this one-off where, okay, well, besides the pandemic, which, crushed the economy, killed, 1 million plus people. If we ignore that, things are great. And you just can't do those sort of things.
People tend to not remember when they do that the main role of a president, right? Things more or less go along, right? The economy is going to do what the economy does, right, unless there's a crisis, right? Foreign policy is going to do what foreign policy does unless there's a crisis. Everything kind of takes care of itself when you're president. Your main function is to respond to crises, because there's going to be a few of them in your presidency. If you're not up to handling those, that ought to be a big red flag for people, but they don't remember that because things kind of took care. It's not like Trump actively did stuff to make the economy better before COVID hit. He kind of stood back and the Fed did its thing and the economy happened, right? You can't say, oh, he had these tax cuts. That didn't do anything to the economy. They never do, right? The trickle-down economic theory doesn't work. If anything, it gets in the way. But the economy was going because the economy goes, right? Unless we have a crisis. And when we had a crisis, he fell on his face. But as you said, people are like, meh. Things seem to be okay until COVID, but who knows? That's just COVID.
Right. So let's talk about the moderators, because during the Biden-Trump debate, the moderators didn't do much at all. But we had a much more active moderation this time around. And conservative media is fairly upset about that. What say you?
Which I think tells you all you need to know about how they think Trump did. If they're focusing on the moderation is unfair, like, why aren't you focusing on who said better things in the debate? It's just the moderators were unfair. Okay. I mean, to me, there wasn't a whole lot of moderation that was actually particularly important, but the stuff that was just kind of crushed him. It's like, oh, we looked into these things and there's nobody eating dogs and cats in Springfield, right? You never think, I'm guessing that Muir didn't wake up thinking, I'm going to have to tell him that people aren't eating dogs and cats in Ohio. But apparently somebody did, because they looked it up for him. And then I loved Trump's answer. Well, I saw it on TV.
Right. I was going to say, there was also the aspect of, executing babies.
Yes, executing babies, right? I think both of those things, it's like to complain about that fact checking is like saying our guy wants to completely lie and make shit up that 95% of the people are going to be like, you're full of crap. But 5% of the people are going to believe him. So don't, well, actually, unfortunately, it's more than that. But X percentage of the people believe him. So don't tell them that he's lying. Like, I don't even understand that argument.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, the lies were so egregious, the moderators just have to step in, right?
Yeah, you can't let somebody say those things.
Yeah, exactly. Because at the end of the day, clearly a lot of people believe these things, right? So you as an organization, to maintain credibility, you have to call out, such crazy things. Like Kamala had some lies too, right? Like this aspect that no U.S. troops have died in combat zones. I mean, that's not true because we have.
Well, what she said is nobody's in an active combat zone now, and apparently that's true. Because I even heard Republicans say, yes, it's true, but we shouldn't discount the danger that American soldiers are in, which is also fair.
I guess it depends how you define that, right? Because we did have U.S. soldiers killed
that's not what she said.
Iranian proxy militias, right?
But she said there's no U.S. soldiers in active war zones right now. That's what.
So I guess it depends how you define active war zone. But
again, like Dale, we talked about the fact checking the other day, right? How Daniel Dale loves to. Okay. Oh, but he said by his count the lies were 33 for Trump, the egregious 33 for Trump, 1 for Harris.
Right. So and that's what the general consensus is, right? Yeah. So I'm pretty pro fact checking. But when it comes to like actually like being fair about it, you just have to call it the really severe, egregious stuff.
Yeah, you can't be fair. When some person lies and says they're killing babies after birth, and the other person maybe is lying about some technicality here or there.
Exactly.
It doesn't matter. Technicality. This is not true. No one's killing babies after birth, even if it is West Virginia, right? They're not doing it either. It's just. And to say it over and what I found was funny is that while I'm watching the debate, he just kept insisting that they're killing cats and dogs in Springfield and eating them. It's like, this is the hill Donald Trump is going to die on. They are killing cats and dogs and eating them, and I don't care what you say. Okay. I don't even know what you do. I thought Harris's the best thing Harris did was she pulled kind of a Donald Trump. She sat back and watched him light himself on fire and was like, yeah, you're just whoo, because that's about you can't debate somebody on that. It's like you've made that up. You're lying. Right. Okay. But I think the moderation was I thought the moderation was good.
Right. Okay, so let's talk focus groups and these undecided voters that are oh so important. At the end of the day, the polling suggests that Harris crushed it, but Biden also crushed it in 2020, and Hillary won every single debate versus Trump. And yet the results were Hillary lost a very close election, and then Biden won a very close election.
Sure, and but we already know Biden completely crapped the bed in the last debate.
Sure.
And he's out.
Right.
So you can have an impactful debate. JFK really got I mean, obviously, this is even before my time, right? But JFK had a great debate against Nixon, and it helped him quite a bit.
Yeah. Right? I'm not convinced that this is going to help. This is not going to help? No. Well, one, because it's too late, right, for Trump to be removed, right? So he's the candidate.
They wouldn't do it. They don't have the balls to remove him.
I just think that whatever happens in October is going to matter. I don't think people are going to remember this debate.
If they don't, that's a complete fumble on the part of the Democrats. I would have my commercial for now until November is they're eating dogs, they're eating cats. I would just show that everywhere, every day, and remind people what a lunatic this guy is. I think that would be a great commercial to run in swing states for these undecided voters. Because if we think, as you said, these undecided, I need to see more policy. No, they don't. They don't care about policy. They don't know what policies differences there are between Trump and Harris. They don't know what the policies are that Biden is doing right now that they say they don't like, right? the way to get to people is to show things that resonate with them. And if you see the other guy running on and on and on and on about immigrants eating dogs and cats, I think that's going to stick.
I think a lot of this is baked in.
Well, I don't know. There was a lot of when I was reading. There's a lot of penetration in social media and TikTok and whatnot about all these things. If young people get motivated to vote, that could be helpful.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. Like, people are going to remember these things. There are tons of memes and whatnot. But at the end of the day, if you look at the undecided voters, they are still undecided after the debate. So that's where I'm kind of getting at this. I don't think the debate matters all that much. And they're either going to stay at home or they're just going to like flip a coin.
See, I'm not sure about that conclusion either, though, because I've looked at two different types of media reports. There were like the instant polling, which CNN put something out that said undecideds were something like 28% more favorable toward Harris after the debate as a group. But then you have all these articles where they're anecdotally looking at one person or five people, and a number of them are like, oh, well, as this undecided voter that you, as the media, have picked out to highlight me as an undecided voter, I'm going to really lean into that and tell you that I'm still undecided and I still have this process where I need to weigh these facts. I am Solon sitting back on my mountain in Greece trying to figure out who is the better candidate and who isn't. So I think if you sort of you take a step back from this idea that, oh, the media is really focusing on these certain undecided voters and giving them a platform, I think those people are leaning into that a little bit. And I think the broader sort of, I guess, data-based assessment that, hey, you know what? Undecideds did move towards Harris in a substantial amount in their reaction to the poll in the aggregate. I think that's useful. And I think like the sample size, I think, is pretty solid because it was something like 67 million people watched the debate, something like a large percentage higher than watched the previous debate. And the previous debate mattered because it got Biden out of the race. I mean, that was elite driven, not voter driven, I think.
Right.
But in the aggregate, it seems that it resonated. And to me, I think that it will, because it's not a policy thing. It's not like, oh, she's come out with this brilliant policy or he's come out with a brilliant policy. It's like she has painted him as this and he has proved that he is. And that's the kind of thing that I think is going to break through, not guaranteed, but it might break through to people that aren't your typical always online, always consuming news voters.
My gut tells me that things are going to just remain static, but we'll see.
So for the next segment, we're going to delve into something a little bit different. We're going to talk about foreign influence, and specifically how foreign influence on our elections, but also on our policy. And you might think, well, why are we talking about this now, right? The big thing going on is the election, but there is foreign influence that we need to think about. We've gotten notices from different areas in the government that people like Russia and Iran, even China, are trying to influence the election, so we should be aware of it. But at the same time, there's been a lot of indictments going on for people that have been trying to either spy for foreign countries or trying to influence American politics through either bribery or outright bribery or just funding of certain pet causes and things like that. So I think it's useful to take a look at what's really going on here. How much do we need to be concerned about this foreign influence and what are its real impacts?
Right. So, one thing I want to preface this with is we are a country of immigrants, right? So whether you're second, first, third generation, I do think that there's always going to be, some sort of connection to where your family originally came from. I think the most famous example would probably be Cuban Americans, because, Cuba was a communist country, and a lot of the immigrants fled communism and ended up in Miami and Florida at large. And Florida has historically been a swing state. So people, as in the politicians and policymakers, have always been sensitive to what this large block of people think. And I think that's perfectly reasonable, right? We also have other lobbying groups such as Armenian Americans who advocate that the U.S. recognize the Armenian genocide. Obviously, Turkish Americans are going to generally be against that. APAC is a organization that is they push for pro-Israeli policies. Right, they tend to be pretty right wing, but I want to distinguish these domestic lobbying groups from actual foreign influence, right? Because many people think that APAC is Israel, trying to influence American policy, but that's just not the case. There's definitely a firewall between the Israeli government, Israeli subsidiaries, Israeli officials, and whatnot from APAC. So
Maybe, I mean, I think it might be useful to define APAC a little bit more, right, for our viewers,
sure.
so they understand this difference between Israel and between APAC. How would you sum that up?
Right. I would say that APAC is Americans who care about Israel as a country, and they want to make sure that American foreign policy towards Israel remains strong.
Right.
That's basically what it boils down to.
I think that's a good definition. I think that's also, I mean, I think maybe people could understand that even a little bit more if you look at, say, the Cubans, right? Because Cuban lobbying has nothing to do with the Cuban government, right?
Exactly.
They're entirely opposed to the Cuban government. It just so happens that the American citizens of Israel, of Jewish extraction or background or whatnot, happen to agree with the more right wing side of Israeli politics, and that's where their lobbying efforts go. The Americans who are of Cuban extraction despise the Cuban government, so their lobbying efforts go the other way. And I think it's useful when we talk about lobbyists. We could go on forever about lobbyists, especially as a political science. I got lots of good things to say. But I think when we think about who's effective, like, why do we hear about the Jewish lobbyists and the Cuban lobbyists, right? Well, one, the Cubans stayed together and they're in Miami and they're a big voting bloc that matters, right? Armenians, Turks, things like people like that, Italians, Irish, spread out throughout the country more. So it's not like you can go talk to them in one point in time and they can influence election by voting in a certain way. The Jewish lobbyists at APAC, they have a lot of money. That's the other way you get influence. It's either money or strategic, a really strategic voting block. And that's why we hear more from them. But I do think your main point is something we should remember. It's like, these are Americans lobbying our government. It's perfectly acceptable for Americans to have views on what's going on overseas. And the whole purpose of lobbying is to let your representatives know, this is my view. And so we should not conflate domestic lobbying with foreign influence, because, as you pointed out, it's completely different.
And we also want to dispel this notion of dual loyalties, right? An Italian American who cares about what happens in Italy. Well, think back to World War II. How many Italian Americans ended up taking up arms, right, against their home country? Almost all of these people are Americans first and foremost. So I don't want to fall into, or I guess I don't want anyone to take away from this conversation that, Cuban Americans, they care more about what happens in Cuba than America, or, people who represent APAC care way more about Israel than what happens in America. No, that's just not the case. Anyway,
it's people that are animated about a certain issue, doesn't necessarily demonstrate a flaw in their character, right? People who are really into into pro-life, right, or pro-choice, they're not necessarily saying, I don't care what happens to the country as long as my views are put forth on abortion. Same thing with gun rights and anti-gun rights activists, right? It's part of the American political dialogue. We have positions, and we should advocate for these positions. And doing that is something that's, that we shouldn't say, oh, you're pushing for a position that favors Israel. It's like, okay, but I think that's the right thing to do. It's like, both of us have ideas on what the policy ought to be towards Israel, towards Ukraine, towards all sorts of things that happen overseas. I teach classes on that to students. right? It doesn't mean that I'm not an American first because I teach, even though I hate that phrase because it's been completely co-opted. So let's see if we can come up with a different phrase. But until we do, right, just because I'm teaching you foreign affairs doesn't mean I think foreign affairs are more important than American government.
Right. So now that we've got all those issues that could cancel us out of the way,
we'll put our soapbox. That soapbox.
Yeah. I want to talk about one of the main tools that we use to combat foreign influence. It's called the Foreign Agents Registration Act, also known as FARA. So FARA came about right before World War II started because there were PR firms that were watering down the hate that came from the Nazi regime. So basically, Nazi propaganda was making its way into America, and obviously that upset a lot of members of Congress. So what did they end up doing? Well, you had the First Amendment, so you should be allowed to spread Nazi propaganda. You should be able to spread any kind of awful stuff. That is kind of the point of free speech, because good speech doesn't need to be protected. Bad speech does. But we still want to
get into that. We could have a discussion about that too, because the Nazi stuff is kind of almost a bridge too far for me. And I am pretty big in but in any case, I don't want to distract us too much. I get your point there. But yeah. I think also, one thing that we're missing too is, we're talking historically. It's like Charles Lindbergh was a huge Nazi apologist and propaganda guy around right before the start of, at least before our involvement in the Second World War. And so it was more than just kind of theoretical propaganda happening, right? He was more or less co-opted by the Nazis into being a figurehead for them. So much so that I think it was HBO or somebody made a series where he's a prominent guy arguing for the Nazis. It's
a good series. I recommend it. It's The Plot Against America.
There you go.
Yeah. I encourage everyone to watch that.
So it wasn't just, these things are happening. It's like, this is what's going on. This person is doing this, and we don't like that.
Yeah.
Which is basically fair.
So basically what it boils down to is you just have to register with the government that, hey, you are a foreign agent. And then, in the 60s, it started going from, instead of propaganda, it shifted to lobbying. But then after the 60s, everyone kind of forgot about it. It was rarely invoked, except for really egregious cases. But ironically, it was Trump's Department of Justice that really started using this as a tool to help combat Russian interference. So to give just some brief background, Paul Manafort was one of Trump's campaign managers, and he was a very, very successful lobbyist. And one of his main clients was the pro-Russian Ukrainian president, Yanukovych. They were really, really buddy together. And you know what? Manafort didn't register as a foreign agent, and then he got nailed for it by the special counsel.
What I don't understand is why these people don't register as foreign agents.
Right. And
I don't see the problem with that. If you're a lobbyist, it doesn't seem like it would hurt your standing as a lobbyist.
Right. So we're going to get into that, right? Because at the end of the day, the regulations surrounding FARA are pretty flexible. You can write to the FARA unit and be like, hey, this is my situation. What do you recommend? And they'll give you an advisory opinion within 30 days. All you have to do is register. That's it. So, I mean, just from like a risk analysis standpoint, it's like you're facing prosecution or maybe some sort of like, it's a foreign agent. But at the end of the day, the stuff that you're peddling anyway, people are going to call you a foreign agent regardless. So to me, I don't see a downside to it. But you know what? Here we are. Now, again, a lot of foreign agents aren't necessarily nefarious, right? For instance, if BMW, they're a German car manufacturer, they have emission standards that are made by the EU. Well, if America has looser emission standards, well, that puts them at a competitive disadvantage. Is it necessarily wrong for BMW to hire a firm that tries to push for stricter emissions in America, I would argue that a lot of Democrats would say, you know what, that is fine. America should have stricter emission standards. It's better for business because everyone's on the same page.
Okay, but what if they're pushing for looser emission standards?
Right. But at the same time, you just got to take it on an issue by issue basis. I don't want to say that all foreign agents are bad or that all foreign lobbying is bad. Sometimes it can be good, right? You need to look at it on a case by case basis.
But I do think that when I mean, the money in lobbying makes a lot of difference, and I think it is problematic if we decide to change our policy as a country because of what some foreign entity might want us to do. Now, I don't think there are a lot of good examples of that, right? So we'll talk about this later on in terms of what's going on in terms of effectiveness. But sure, when you're talking about what these foreign interests are trying to do, when they represent themselves and say, "Hey, I'm a foreign interest," then I think this sort of a toothlessness baked into this law. There's not a lot. If you register as a foreign agent, it's not like they come to your house and they see everything you do and they tell you can say this, you can't say that. You can do this, you can't do that. You have to tell, if you get money, you have to pay this. You can't get money for this. You can't get money for it's. Yeah. It's just like, yep, you're doing it, right? So I think in some ways the government is acknowledging that you're a foreign agent. It's not that big a deal from the perspective of that law in any case. I think where we get into trouble are these people that try to hide it. Right. And they're hiding it because what they're doing, in addition to being a foreign agent, is problematic. And I think that's where we get into people like Bob Menendez, for example. Like, he's working as a foreign agent. I think it was for Egypt.
Yes. Yeah.
He's not revealing this because he's taking bribes.
Right. Yeah. And for those of you who don't know who Bob Menendez is, yes, he was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in the U.S. Senate. So think about that for a second. You have the highest ranking foreign policy official in the Senate is a foreign agent for Egypt. That level of infiltration is just shocking. And then it's sort of like egregious, right? We have the indictment linked in the show notes, but he was getting gold bars as compensation. When the FBI raided his house, they found cash everywhere. His wife had a no-show job. Some of the things that he did where he would pressure government officials to benefit, Egyptian businessmen. He would give the sign-offs on billions of dollars worth of military aid towards Egypt. And the list goes on, right? And the crazy thing is he was indicted before, back during the Obama administration, for bribery and fraud. But the jury ended up being hung. So, I mean, it's just shocking how, you would almost be caught and then you get off and then you just continue doing this behavior. It's just insane to me.
To continue our TV show theme, if you're a fan of The Sopranos and he's from New Jersey, it's not all that surprising.
There you go. And we recommend The Sopranos as well.
Yes, we do, very heartily.
Now, this next set of people, we're going on the theme of, infiltration. These people have been indicted. They have not been found guilty. So everything that I say, you must take it as an allegation. But I must add the caveat that if DOJ indicts you, their conviction rate is very, very high. So that's my disclaimer. So we had a woman named Linda Sun, who was an aide to both Governor Cuomo of New York and Governor Hochul. I'm not from New York, so I don't know how to pronounce her. Okay. And she was a pretty high-ranking official under Hochul. So what did she do that was so bad, right? Well, she was a foreign agent for China. And what does China want to do? Typically, they just want the Chinese Communist Party to have a relatively clean perception. And they really, really want to downplay any sort of independence from autonomous regions of China. So whether
basically they want China to look good and Taiwan to look bad.
Yeah.
Right? And this
Yeah.
Linda Sun pushed for that in the administration. And I know in New York, and I know we're going to get to the real reason you want to talk to this in a second, because what did they pay her with, Justin?
Well, so besides the millions of dollars that were laundered into multi-million dollar homes, expensive cars, it was the Nanjing salted duck. Um, you know what? Personally, I wouldn't take the millions, but I might sell out my country for, you know what, Nanjing salted duck. Or is it Nanking?
I believe it's Nanjing these days.
Okay, so there you go. And you know, she would make sure that messaging was CCP friendly. So yes, remove references to
Allegedly.
Taiwan.
We need
Yes,
to keep
allegedly. Let's downplay any sort of references to Uyghur persecution. So it did have a policy impact there, right? And I would argue that she did not have America's best interests. This last one we'll go over real quick, but this was with an ally of South Korea, Sumi Terry. DOJ said, yes, challenge accepted. I will sue you.
That's still a bad pun.
I know. But she was able to infiltrate to pretty high ranks. She worked formerly for the CIA, the National Security Council, and then she worked for the think tank on the Council on Foreign Relations. She was such a big deal that she was able to have face-to-face meetings with Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. So you might wonder, well, why are we talking about this? This doesn't seem like a big deal. Well, she was taking notes that she took when meeting Blinken, would give them to the South Korean intel services. She would make sure that her messaging was in line with what the South Koreans wanted. And that's where it gets really dicey with FARA violations, right? You can have interactions, you can consult with foreign governments, but what you can't do is coordinate. And because the South Koreans were basically controlling the messaging, that made her a foreign agent. And it's just a real shame because she did really, really good work. She is one of the top experts we have on North and South Korean policy. But you know, she was taking money, not only for
allegedly.
Yes, she was getting paid with expensive dinners and Louis Vuitton handbags. So you know, if you're the DOJ, it's like, gosh, you know what? I just have to indict you just because the evidence is there. And even though you're an ally and even though you do good work, we have to apply the rule of law here.
So I think it's I think most people find it pretty easy to get their heads wrapped around the ideas. Like if you're working in policy and you're being paid off by a foreign government, right? That's not good, right? That's a violation. I don't think you're going to get much pushback on that. I think we're going to turn our focus a little bit and talk about people trying to influence elections, right? That's when it gets a little more difficult, right? Do we have any evidence that an election has turned because of foreign influence? No, we don't, right? Do we have evidence that candidates have adopted different policy positions because of foreign influence? Yeah, not really there either. But people pay attention. We have people in our government trying really hard to stop foreign influence, and we have foreign governments really trying to create some sort of influence. So I think it's worth looking at from that perspective. These aren't the people that are within the government taking bribes to try to change things illicitly. These are people trying to influence all of us into voting a different way or supporting different policies. And so I think that's very interesting to look at from that perspective.
All right. So the most recent indictment regarding a FARA violation was with these two individuals who worked for Russia Today, which is a state-controlled media from Russia. They had this $10 million scheme where they would hire right-wing influencers in America, some pretty big names, such as Tim Pool, and they would basically curate the content and pay them pretty large sums of money. So, for instance, Tim Pool, even though he's a really popular guy, he's getting $100,000 per episode.
So Can you? I'm not connected to that sphere of the news. Can you explain for me and our other viewers who Tim Pool is?
Yeah, so Tim Pool is a right wing influencer. He gets up to 1 million daily views on his podcast. So very popular. It was kind of like the alt right crowd.
Gotcha.
Um, there are other people who just got paid stupid amounts of money. Getting paid $400,000 a month. This is like professional athlete level salaries, right? Um, and even people on like the top talent in Fox News, they're not getting paid this kind of money. So it just kind of goes to show you like the level of suspicion that you should have if you're receiving this kind of money, right? Now, these people have said, "Oh, I didn't know where this money was coming from. I didn't know it was Russia. I condemn this." Blah 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 blah. But if you read between the lines, it's pretty egregious in my opinion. And I think that this kind of just goes to show you that the way Russia views things is that they view the right wing in America as being easily influenced, right?
I believe the term they generally use is useful idiot.
Right. Now,
And
I don't.
actually, that's not my term. That the Russian. That's the Russians have described American.
Right.
I guess we've described people resources as that too, but
Yeah.
particularly the Russians like to use that.
Right. And it's just, I don't want to say that these people wouldn't have these views anyway. I think the vast majority of these people, they want to have, a contrarian view to the administration. They want to be anti-establishment. So it's a natural fit for Russian propaganda, right? Because the way the Russians view things is they view that the world order dictated by America is bad for their interests, right? So they will try and push narratives and highlight any sort of like discontent in America in order to undermine, our influence in the world. And we have U.S. senators such as J.D. Vance and Ron Johnson. They push Russian propaganda all the time. And again, like I don't think that J.D. Vance or Ron Johnson are just taking checks through various shell companies, right? That's not how this works once you get to this point. But I do think that J.D. Vance will read an article from, like, say, The Federalist. The Federalist might get some poorly sourced article from somewhere. And then you go a couple organizations down, and that's when you start getting into these like state-sponsored initiatives from Russia, right? So what J.D. Vance and Ron Johnson are doing isn't illegal by any stretch of the imagination, right? They're just useful idiots.
In any number of ways. So
right.
We had this discussion offline, and I want to just kind of get back to it because I think it's useful to have. Is that they say you're J.D. Vance and you retweet or echo certain number of policies, right? How much does it matter if X% is some guy at the troll farm in Russia has created these memes that you're rebroadcasting? I have a hard time getting worked up by this aspect of foreign influence because I'm not sure there aren't Americans that are going to fill the if there aren't these Russian memes to retweet. I think there's plenty that are domestically generated. For example, right? Springfield is my thing for my sort of talking point for the week, right? If domestic Republicans and right-wing nut jobs are going to invent that Haitian immigrants are eating dogs and cats in Springfield, Ohio, why do we need? I mean, what are the Russians going to add to that conversation that's going to make it worse? Right? Right. I guess that's my suspicion of how I don't think they're particularly effective. I think that they're giving them more fodder. And sure, okay, we can talk about this, we can talk about that. But I think that what they do is they look for. I mean, they know what the right wing likes, right? So they put out stuff that kind of jibes with what the right wing likes. But the right wing has people of their own doing the same thing. So,
right, it's like a chicken egg scenario, right? And I would agree with you there that the Russians aren't the one starting a lot of this stuff, right? I think they're latching on to discontent in general. Though I will say, when JD Vance says, "Why are we giving money to Ukraine?" So Zelensky can buy yachts for all of his buddies. That level of detail is clearly coming from Russia, right? And we have evidence of that.
I mean, several levels, but is that different than everything else he says? That I mean, I think he comes by his lack of support for Ukraine, and maybe not because he believes it, but because he thinks it's very useful for him with his voters to be that way. If this is a good example of something it can reinforce that. I think that's a good point. That the Russians might give them something as, hey, you can use this to reinforce your point. I think that's definitely happening.
And this isn't limited to just Russia too, right?
Oh, no, the Iranians are big at it.
Yeah, the Iranians have been I will say, like, when it comes to, like, say, the college protests regarding the Israel-Gaza war, there are genuinely real grassroots concerns for the people of Gaza, right? But Iran, what they're going to do is they're going to amplify that conflict, right? They're going to just, whether it's through bots or highlighting certain influencers, they're going to really push that message because it's in Iran's best interest to make Israel look horrible, to downplay the atrocities of Hamas and all that. A lot of countries will engage in these sort of propaganda campaigns, but right now I believe that Russia is the clear number one, and then followed by Iran, at least when it comes to American policy. I know that China is probably has their tentacles everywhere.
Shouldn't they?
I don't fault them for that. No,
you do the same thing,
right? Yeah. I don't fault them at all. And I think what I want, like, our listeners and viewers to kind of take away from this is, you know what, you just got to be aware that it's happening, right? And sometimes the message is good, right? If you care about the people of Gaza and you think what the Israeli administration is doing is wrong, and you happen to, like, hear Iranian amplified media, it's just, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You just need to be aware that, hey, you know what, like, this country that is clearly adversarial to us is also supporting this. So I want to make sure that I can distance myself in certain ways, right? And
I think in a lot of ways, it kind of ties back to what we talked about a few weeks ago when we talked about how do you consume media,
right?
And to be a good consumer of media, or at least good for yourself, and I mean, not for, there's no good in consuming media, but to consume it properly, you should be skeptical about a lot of things you see. You should check out your sources, right? Have a few, again, like I think I mentioned that I tell my students, find some sources that you trust and make sure, see what they think about it, right? If you see something online that's like, oh, this bad stuff is happening in some certain country that you care about, go see what the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or all these other sources have to say to make sure that's really going on. If you're really concerned that Haitians are eating your fellow Americans' dogs and cats in Springfield, Ohio, check out what the Times says. Don't like the Times because it's too left-wing? Check out the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal will tell you no one is eating dogs and cats in Springfield, Ohio, right? So I think you're absolutely correct that we should be skeptical about stuff that aligns with foreign governments' interests. But we should be skeptical in any case because there's plenty of Americans willing to take advantage of anybody that lets their guard down for a second. They know what people want to hear. The trolls out there are very good at figuring out what people want to hear, and they'll tell you what you want to hear. So when you see something that this lines up with what I want to hear, but I don't know this source, I would check it out.
Yeah. John Smith from Tennessee Oblast is not a good source.
More likely than not. And so, I mean, like, if you think about some of these influence efforts that the Russians are doing, like they paid off, was it the black separatist radio activist in Miami or something? Is like, they have no reach. Nobody listens to that. I mean, they have some people, but they have absolutely no impact on elections or anything of the sort. But the Russians think, it's just money, right? We'll throw a little money at these people, see what happens. And I think that's the major impact of what they're doing is like, we'll see. We'll throw stuff. Right. Maybe something will catch on, something won't. I don't think they expect any real impact on policy based on their efforts. But why not? Give it a shot. Why not try?
It's extremely low risk for them.
They have a lot of ex-KGB agents sitting around not doing anything. Why not do this?
And for our recurring economic segment, we are going to talk about Kamala Harris's housing policy. Jonathan, let's
Yeah, so
outline
I,
that.
I mean, I think it's very useful to have a housing policy, right? Especially these days, it's kind of commonly accepted that housing prices are too high, and it's hard to argue that housing prices are not too high. I mean, where I live, housing prices have gone through the roof since we bought a house. It's very, very difficult for young families to buy houses in Boulder County, Colorado, and I'm 100% convinced it's even harder for people to buy houses out in California, where you are, Justin. So something we should do something about this, right? There's a couple problems. One, the interest rates are high, but they're coming down, so that's useful. And it seems like they're going to come down again because inflation is down. Also useful, something you should hear I'm guessing you're going to hear Harris talking about even more and more again. But her solution really is, hey, what we'll do is we'll give a $25,000 down payment assistance to first-time buyers, and then we'll give tax incentives and federal land for builders to build 3 more housing units, right? Both of these sound pretty interesting, but they're kind of competing solutions, right? If you give buyers $25,000 towards a house, you're going to increase demand. You'll have people like, hey, I've got more money. I can buy a house. I'm good. I'm ready to go. I want to buy a house now that I have this money, right? If we know, remember, anything from our economics, when demand goes up, price goes up. So that's a problem.
Yeah, we should add the caveat though that it is only for new construction that this applies.
Right. But in any case, it is increasing demand.
Yes.
It's a demand side boost where
Yes.
you're giving people who want to buy a house an incentive to actually do so. So when demand goes up, if the stock things of the goods stay the same, price will go up. So they're thinking at the same time, we better do something on the supply side. We'll give all these incentives to builders to build 3 million units of housing, which is actually that, if you increase the supply of something, then the price goes down. So these things compete a little bit. So the administration really needs to hope that the effects of the supply side increase are stronger than the demand side increase. Otherwise, all you're going to do is, at best, nothing, and at worst, drive prices up even more. So hopefully we won't see that. But it does raise a question of why are you doing both? Why not just improve the supply? If you just improved supply, then the only thing that would happen is prices would go down, right?
Right.
So why drive demand? And to me, and I think it's pretty obvious, that it's all political. It sounds good. If you're a first-time home buyer and you're struggling, we'll help you out, right? Really good politics if people don't dig into it too much.
Right. And I also think that, new construction takes time, right? So I think this is also kind of like a temporal there's a temporal aspect to this, right? Where it's like, hey, we can help these people now.
Yeah.
But the problem is it's inflationary, as you said before. It's just going to increase demand, just going to drive up the price. So yeah, I mean, it's a really tricky issue, right? Because, when my parents bought their first home, interest rates were sky high, above 10%. But it didn't really matter because the home prices were much more reasonable. You could get like a house in San Diego for like $150,000 at like a 12% interest rate. I'm just making up numbers, but it's ballpark right. But now a $2 million home at 8% or 7% is probably more accurate. It's just completely out of reach for people.
Well, even here, like the median house price in Boulder itself, the city, is $1 million. Housing prices out in the suburbs of Boulder, where I live, went from around 150 when we bought our house to upwards of 750 now, and that's a tough mortgage payment for a family to make.
It's very tough, very tough. So you need to have $200,000 down. So the only way you're getting that is if you already have a previous home, or if you
relatives,
or rich relatives. And there's obviously going to be massive hesitation to address like the money down issue, because we had the financial crisis in 2008 where people were getting homes for no money down. So honestly, this is really basic on some level, right? The inputs are pretty straightforward, but coming up with a viable solution, I think, is really, really difficult. There's just risks everywhere you go. I think for most people, it makes sense to use these rent versus buy calculators to basically say, okay, here's like what the average rent is in my the place I want to live. Here's what the average home price is. Here are the interest rates. And it basically says, how long will it take for you to balance it out between renting versus buying, right? And the higher the interest rates, the longer it's going to take for you to actually make money. This is assuming that your delta between your rent versus buy, you're investing the rest, right? You don't want to just like sit on cash. But yeah, I mean, in a lot of areas, we're talking about 15 to 20 years before it makes sense to buy. So in some ways, I think it makes sense to just hold off and wait for this new construction, right? And this also applies to rent prices, right? In a lot of these,
it also depends. It depends on how long you're planning to be there, right? If you're planning to be somewhere for a long time, then anytime you wait is lost, unless you want to wait for lowest. I mean, there's all kinds of calculations, right? So I don't imagine this will be a quick fix. I'm sure it won't be. It will be interesting to see if she manages to go ahead with the down payment assistance, what that will do to prices and how long it will take for the new stock to come into play to lower prices.
Yeah, right? I honestly think that'll be a disaster. I am very bearish on that passing.
I'm not confident either. On the other hand, we could take the Trump approach, right? We probably should give the Trump idea for what to do about housing, and his theory is, well, we're going to deport more than 11 million people because he thinks the numbers are crooked, and all those houses will be available for anybody who needs a house. So there's that idea for increasing the supply and lowering demand.
Yeah, Gen Z and millennials for Trump now, I guess.
I'm not sure that'll work out quite as smoothly as he's thinking. Although apparently he announced today that he's going to start in Colorado and Ohio, so I'll get to view it up close and personal if this does come to pass. Oh boy.
Well, see, but that's the problem, though, right? Like, there's a vested interest in homeowners to keep home prices high, right? Because so much of their wealth is tied up into their homes.
Oh yeah, that's why we have all kinds of stuff out here. Open space and agreements like you can't build houses here, you can't build houses there. It does nothing but drive up the prices of housing in Boulder and Boulder County.
Yeah, so like we said, difficult issue, but we'll see what happens. Let's just hope that home prices stabilize to some degree, because I think for this younger generation, and my generation included, it's starting to get really, really bad, and we're just basically going to rely on inheritance from our parents to inherit.
To go the other way around. We're supposed to be able to rely on our children to take care of us in our old age. What the heck?
Yeah. So, anyways, I want to thank our viewers for listening. Hope you learned a little bit about our debate analysis, foreign influence in our elections, as well as the housing policy.
Yeah. We'll see you next week.